Good morning, everyone. Just give me a minute to share my screen and get everything running. All right, so good morning. We're talking about the connected consumer today, the demographics of the over-the-top consumer. This is the complete opposite of how I spent my weekend. I think it's the first time since February we got out in the wild, went camping, went off the grid, totally disconnected. So today's the opposite. We're going to talk about connected content. Just to give you a little context and some definitions around the research that we're going to be discussing today. First, subscription video on demand. Here we're talking about everything from Apple TV Plus, Netflix, to sports networks such as UFC and Major League Baseball, and TV network apps like PBS Masterpiece. Second, we're going to focus a little bit in on advertising supported video on demand or free streaming. We're going to be discussing services from Plex to Pluto TV. Just one quick research note, the aggregated data here is going to exclude YouTube. Granted, YouTube is a very big player in the market. Actually, that's the challenge is so many people use the service that it washes out the demographics a little bit, so that'll be discussed discreetly. And then lastly, the transactional part of the business, what's going on with digital movie and TV show purchases and rentals from services such as Vudu, Fandango Now, and others. That said, let's jump into the content for today. So these virtual conferences, they're a little bit different than getting to connect live. We don't have that same opportunity to really just, get the energy from the room and speak one-on-one like that. So I'm going to change the format a little bit. We're going to talk about 12 things you need to know. We're going to do this in 12 charts today. It's going to take us about 20-25 minutes or so. So stick with us. The first topic here is this is a mass market audience now. This might just sound like a little commonplace, but it's really important when we think about the context of the businesses that we're speaking about. So, first, the key point here is that all of the VOD distribution channels, they've exited the early adopter stage. We're looking at an early majority or late majority audience. Let me take a second to put this into context. What we're viewing here is a traditional technology consumer adoption curve. If you think about the yellow part of the curve, those innovators, those are folks that they love to learn about the new tech. They share it with all of their friends and family. And when a product really starts to begin to take off, it'll hit that early adopter tech stage. When we were talking about direct-to-consumer subscription video on demand apps over the past couple of years, a lot of the conversation really surrounded when is it going to leave that early adopter stage and really start to hit an early majority where we see a mass market customer base really increase the scale of the audience that we're reaching with the programming that's being distributed. That really began to happen in spades when Disney Plus launched back in November. So if we take the aggregate of traditional services such as Netflix and Hulu, as well as some of the newer ones like Disney Plus, what we're seeing is nearly 8 in 10, 79% of viewers are engaged in at least one of those subscription video on demand services. And that's 2 times the scale that we're seeing from free streaming or transactional video on demand right now. However, both of those platforms as an aggregate, they've also exited that early adopter stage. They've done so a little while ago, and that really matters when it comes to the demographics that the distribution channel's reaching, how we target the customers, and the impact that it has on distribution of digital video. So the second topic here, we're going to focus a little bit in on the transactional video on demand customer, those folks that are buying and renting digital movies. This is a market I've been tracking since I think about 2008, and a lot of the demographic messaging has stayed pretty consistent during that time. The key thing here is that it's reaching a younger audience. So if you look at the bar on the far right, that's our transactional digital customer. 42% of that audience is still age 18 to 34. If you contrast that to the bar on the far left, the TV and movie norm, this norm is basically anybody that's watched TV or video at home, on the go, or in the movie theater. So the vast majority of the population. And what we continue to see here is that the age profile of the transactional customer is younger. That really resonates when you're focusing on your marketing and distribution strategy because you're just targeting a different customer base. The other challenge here is that it hasn't reached the broader demographic base despite all of the years in the marketplace. which does challenge it from reaching that mass scale that we've seen with subscription video on demand services. So if you look at that second bar there, really what we're seeing is that the SVOD subscriber pretty closely mimics the normative customer base when it comes to, you know, the age of the customer itself. And free streaming, it fits somewhere in the middle. But to be honest here, the story isn't, it kind of gets washed out when we look at the channels themselves in aggregate. When we start to look at the discrete services, a lot more comes to light. The example I'll give you to start to frame the discussion is UFC Fight Night or Downtown Abbey. These are probably the two most disparate examples we could give to help explain the different age demographic of the customer that we're reaching here. So before we dig into the data on this chart, just a minute to explain how it's represented. The gold dots there, that's the percentage of each services base that's age 18 to 34. The green dots, that's the percentage of the base for a service that's age 35 to 54, and the blue is age 55 plus. If you look across the x-axis, these are the 55 subscription and advertising video on demand services that we've been measuring through our new research study, the TV switching study. This was some new research that we launched back in April, and the whole focus is really to understand the level of engagement across the services, which ones consumers are switching out of, which ones they're actually moving into, and a lot about the demographics of those users and how they differ. So if you start to zero in on some of the data on this chart, I'd like for you at first to focus in on that box on the top left. What we're seeing is that those are the subscription and advertising services that have 50% or more of their base coming from an audience that's younger, age 18 to 34. And when you really focus in on what those particular services are, 30% of them are sports like UFC Fight Pass or Bleacher Report Live. 19% of them are family-oriented services like Kid Genius or DC Universe. And 19% are advertising supported services, something like LG's Channel Plus that's largely supported by Xumo. So really what we're seeing is that while the overall story for subscription video on demand shows a demographic profile that's kind of balanced, it represents the norm. When you start to parse out all of the different services that are in market for folks like us to watch, you pretty quickly see that the demographic target is discretely different. Now, if you focus in on the right-hand side of this chart for a moment, what you're seeing is those services that tend to reach an older audience. What we're calling out here, your premium movie channels, ones like Showtime, Stars, or Epix Now. The traditional premium movie channels, even their subscription video on demand apps, they tend to reach an older audience. And the example I started with, Downtown Abbey on PBS Masterpiece, not surprisingly, a service like that does a good job reaching a little bit of an older audience itself. What you're not seeing on this chart, but we're going to see in a lot of the discussion over the next 20 minutes or so, is services like Netflix or even Disney Plus to some extent that have a very large scale audience base. I think Netflix has over 60 million US subs. They tend to fall in the middle. They tend to define the norm. And that in large part is determined because of their large scale. To have that level of success, they've had to get to a point where they've really reached a balanced demographic audience, as opposed to some of these channels that are, really developing right now at this point in time. So point number 4, men, they're generally earlier tech adopters. When it comes to free streaming video, it's really no different. Now, I know this is a little divergent from where I started, saying that all of these categories have left the early adopter stage. Indeed, they really have. But what we're seeing with AVOD is it's in that early majority, and it's still exhibiting some of the demographic profile characteristics that are really incumbent of services, of channels that are transitioning from the early adopter to the early majority stage. So again, same chart we looked at before for age. We're looking at the gender audience itself, and not surprisingly, that free streaming video user is 55% male. The transaction customer, the subscription video on demand customer, generally fits the normative profile overall. But what we'll see when we start to dig into the 55 services, again, that story is very, very different. I was psyched when I found this illustration to really tee up the next chart. And it's, don't even think that you're not watching Hallmark. I'll admit, I've watched it with the wife. I know all of these stories end happily ever after. The demographic differences and the reason for highlighting Hallmark movies now, it is the one service out of everyone that we measured that truly does reach a much more female skewed audience, but not you might think that that would be up in a 60, 70, 80% range, and it's just not. It's 50% female, 44% male. And it really shows how, that co-viewing is helping generate a broader audience for the service itself. So let's take a step back, talk a little bit about some of the other data points that we're seeing here in the gender balance. Similar to what we saw with age, sports and free streaming video really drive the male-oriented services, something like NBA League Pass, UFC Fight Pass, or on the AVOD side, Zumo or Plex free streaming. They reach a more male-oriented customer base. What we're going to see with free streaming, though, is it really runs the gamut, and that's just a thought I want you to keep on the side right now, especially for when we get to that income slide. There might be, a bit of a hypothesis that free reaches a lower income segment. That's not necessarily untrue, but when you look at different services, it really is rather dynamic. A service like Plex reaches a very different audience than a lot of its other competitors. It's more male-oriented. It's actually more affluent, too. So the second point here, if you zero in on the middle to the right, Amazon Prime Video, Netflix, Disney Plus, these are some of the larger services, some of the more mature services. Not surprisingly, they really reach a more balanced gender demographic. And again, that's just attributed to the level of scale that the services have. We're going to talk a little bit about households with children in a minute, but I thought this might be a good point to just stop for a second. See if there were any questions or thoughts around the research that we've presented so far. We're going to give this a shot. It's a little harder in a virtual format, but if any of you guys do have some thoughts on the research or some things you'd like me to zero in on, now would be a great time to throw those questions out there, and Eric's going to help us moderate that.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so we can do this a couple of ways. If you have some questions, of course, one thing you can do is just type it into the Q&A section in Zoom. If you all haven't done that before, there's a little button that says Q&A on your console. Just click that and type your question in. It's also really cool that we can bring you to the mic, or bring the mic to you rather. So if you have a question, you can literally raise your hand and I will call on you. And you have a chance to ask a question that way. You can also put it in the chat. Some people do that as well. So we'll find you wherever you are. Okay, perfect. I have a question first, actually. John, I think I saw my old cell phone and MP3 player in one of your slides back there. I'm wondering where you got that and if you still use it.
I'm going to have to attribute that to Teresa and our marketing team. She's awesome. When I came up with the idea to use some of these cut slides, she's been great at just finding illustrations that reflect some of the key messaging we're looking at. I'll be honest with you, there's some devices on that chart I haven't even identified what they are yet. But I was actually one of those guys using an MP3 player before the iPod came out. I think I had the Rio. If you all were downloading MP3s back in 98 and 99, you might remember that.
Oh, yeah. I do remember that. I had a Rio as well. I probably still have it somewhere. I have a hard time throwing my stuff away, I guess. But we do have a question here from Beth Clearfield. Thanks, Beth. Was I reading correctly that Amazon skews slightly female and Netflix slightly male? If so, can you account for that? That's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to consider when you're thinking about the big services such as Amazon and Netflix is that there's a relatively balanced demographic profile. If we're seeing a skew of 2 or 3 percentage points one way or another, we're seeing that skew in the case of Netflix against a base of like 60 million viewers. So it's not one of those ones that I would draw a lot of attention to say that they're having success in one direction or another. That's very strong. Amazon generally does have a little bit more of a female skew, and that can be attributed to a lot of how they're procuring their subscribers. It's coming in from that Amazon Prime shopping base, not necessarily just people that are jumping in and saying, I'm looking for streaming video. What I'll say last on that topic is Disney Plus is probably the most dynamic large service when it comes to the demographic profile. And we're going to see a little bit more of that when we get into the households with children data in just a second.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth, for that question. Here's another question from Cameron Douglas. On the previous chart, what is the axis on the left axis, the x-axis on the last chart?
Yeah, so if you're going to look at all of these charts that have the dots, the x-axis represents each of the 55 ad-supported and subscription services that we're measuring. So just to give you an example on how to read this, looking at Hallmark movies now, it's saying that 56% of those that subscribe to that channel are female, and alternatively to 44% are male. That would be that blue dot underneath it. What I've done in order to really present data on 55 services in a single chart is focus on what the key themes are here. And that's why I'm just calling out a handful of the services that really reflect the key messages that we're seeing within the data.
Thanks, John. Question here, what TVOD partners were included in the set of demographics data that was just shared? So what TVOD partners?
Yeah, TVOD includes everything. It's a very wide spectrum, everything from Fandango Now to a consumer using like Xfinity cable to purchase a movie to own it. And we've even included some of the newest services like Row 8 in there. So everybody's represented to the extent of their particular scale. If we start to break out the demographics, we will in some cases see differences. However, for the most part, these services are offering up the same movies and TV shows. So in general, TVOD as a category behaves in a similar manner. But you will see things like, the Vudu service itself is a little more distinct. It shows a little bit more of that early adopter, male, younger audience than some of the others.
Well, I didn't see the Eric Hansen mixology channel in that quite yet, but I'm sure that's going to be cropping up pretty soon. Question from Tom Schwack. What is the difference between AVOD and FAST?
So it's so difficult to start to really delineate all of the definitions here. So for today, when we're seeing anything that we're talking about free streaming video or advertising supported on demand, what we're looking at is services such as Plex, Pluto TV, Zumo TV, Tubi. The aggregate itself has YouTube removed. As I said in the beginning, because of its massive scale, the demographic of YouTube really does sway some of the findings that we're able to pull out of some of the newer services. The other thing that is not represented here is a service such as CBS All Access or Hulu that has an ad-supported tier. That ad-supported tier, I do recognize that that's ad-supported video on demand, but for this particular presentation, we've seen that as a broader subscription service included in that in SVOD. It's something we can always break out in a research, but we just tried to keep it simple for today.
Okay, cool. Why don't we take one more question, and then we'll take a break at the end for some more. From Connie Harrison, is there any relevance to look at geographic component in the demography? Thank you for using the word demography. Is there relevance to look at geographic component in the demography? Is this US or worldwide?
Yeah, a short answer is yes. This research is all US based, and what we'll actually see on point number 11 in a minute or two is geography does matter even within the US. We'll talk very specifically about why it matters and where. So just give us a minute or two and we're going to get to that. But love the question because we just agree completely. It matters.
Excellent. All right. Well, John, I'm going to leave the stage, as it were, and let you take it from here. Thanks.
Hey, thanks so much, Eric. So point number 6, do you have kids? It matters. It makes a difference. Now, when we're looking at the each of the 3 categories, again, the yellow part of the bar here represents the percentage of households that have children under 18 living at home. Again, the key thing that we see is that transactional part of the business. Remember, it reaches a younger customer. The younger customer is more likely to have children at home. In part, this is a strong thing because that's a customer base that tends to be a heavier user, tends to be a more affluent customer base as well, and just a stronger generator of revenue for the industry itself. What we'll see is as you get to the free streaming user, that profile drops off a little bit. And for subscription, again, overall, it mimics the norm to more of an extent. But when we look service by service, it's not necessarily the case. This is one of the findings that I found really interesting. Amongst all of the family or children's services that we measured, every single one of them had proportionately more households with children than Disney Plus did. So if we look again on the top left, again, the x-axis here is a representation of the 55 free and subscription services that we're measuring. All of the children's services are fitting in that box. All of them have more children in a household proportionately within their subscriber base than we're seeing for Disney Plus. Now, Disney Plus is a little bit more than 50% households with children. And I think that's a really important message here. The service itself isn't just reaching families. The content array that's available is broad enough that it's bringing in a wide spectrum of subscribers, which is really helping it grow its base rapidly and start to play along the lines of some of the more mature services like Netflix. The next thing that we're seeing is those more mature services like Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, or YouTube, Hulu On Demand itself. They tend to match the norm. Roughly 6 in 10 of the subscribers don't have kids within the home. And again, this is really reflective of them meeting a broader audience, a later adopter audience itself. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about income. Paying for each movie, it's not cheap. That's really reflective when you look at the household income demographics for the different customer bases. 55% of the transactional on-demand user base has a household income of $75,000 or greater. That really, if you look in contrast to the free streaming video norm of 46%, it's pretty stark. It's a pretty big difference. And this is just, one of those simplistic findings here, but I think it has a lot of value in working through it. The households that have extra money to spend, they're buying the extras, and that really surfaces in a type of services that you see these particular households subscribing to and buying. So again, let's focus in on that top left. These are the free and subscription services that more than 50% of their base is coming from households with an income over $75,000. What we're seeing here is premium movie channels really surface. Remember before, that was the older customer base. It's also the more affluent customer base. So folks that are subscribing to a channel such as Showtime, they really reach a different audience than somebody that's subscribing to a lot of the other direct-to-consumer and free streaming services that are available. The next thing that you're seeing is sports. It's not just PGA Tour that we know reaches an older, more affluent audience. It's also a mature service like MLB.TV. These are generally extras. For the most part, the sports leagues are giving you extra programming out of market sports when you subscribe to the channel. And then the last thing you're seeing is a service like Apple TV Plus, really rocking out the top spot. It's that iOS user that's a more affluent user. They tend to have more discretionary income, but we see that same thing surfacing for Amazon Prime Video customers, and to a lesser extent, those that are subscribing to Netflix themselves. I really want to focus a little more on income when it comes to free streaming video. Generally, if you look at a norm for the category, it's a lower income category. You can see that reflected there in that top box, right? That's that box. 50% or more of the base has an income of $75,000 or greater. And the key thing that we're seeing here is nothing. There's no service. There's no free streaming service in that box. I mean, that's generally what's driving the norm. It's not hitting that more affluent customer base that's more apt to be subscribing to traditional cable or satellite TV and doesn't generally need that, basic TV programming that a service like Pluto is going to provide. So let's set that thought aside for just a second, because it really doesn't tell the whole story. You check out a service like TV Plus on Samsung TVs, and it's right up there with 50% of the audience having an income of $75K or more. And if you think about it, Samsung TVs tend to be larger, higher end displays. It's driving their service reaching a bit of a higher end customer. We talked for a minute or so ago about Plex, right? Plex is reaching that early adopter techie audience. It's really noticeable in the more male-oriented, younger audience itself, but it's also a more affluent audience. So as they convert from their traditional business model, offering more and more ad-supported and free streaming television, it's drawing a different audience into this market than a service like Pluto TV or Tubi Movies and TV has been. If you check it out on the far right there, those services, they're reaching the least affluent audience of all of the streaming services, really serving up a lot of value to an audience that's cut the cord and isn't subscribing to traditional cable or satellite TV. All right, so the last point on this chart, this one's important, the Roku channel's right smack in the middle. Roku's reaching roughly 27 million US households through their hardware base. That's Roku streaming media players, or Roku TV. And what's happening there is they have a roughly broad, balanced demographic audience that they're reaching with their hardware platform. And that for them on their free streaming service is translating also into reaching a more balanced income demographic than you're seeing with a lot of the other services. The key message here is really simple. The free streaming market doesn't reach just one particular customer base. Each of the services that are out there are really reaching a different audience. And as they mature, they're going to start to see some convergence and more competitive pressure from what the other ones are offering. So we had a question about, does it matter where you are before? Yeah, where you're at does matter. And this is a chart from a research study my colleague Eddie Holt did a couple months back. And it's a Rural America report. Part of me thinks he did this project because he wanted to travel across country and do some interviews with people and understand the dynamics and impact of broadband on the streaming video marketplace. I mean, we learned a lot of great things, like, you know, people are like, yeah, of course, I use Netflix. And then they go, well, how does that work for you? Go, well, you know, if anybody else in town starts using Netflix, my broadband connection buffers down, it just stops working, and I have to pop in a DVD. And what you're seeing on this chart is the green states. Those are ones where less than 50%, there's less than 50% broadband household penetration. So if we're thinking about everything we discussed so far around streaming and digital video, you know, there are a lot of parts of the country where you're just not reaching many viewers with that kind of distribution. So as you think about marketing campaigns, distribution, and where you're pushing out your messaging and the audience that you're reaching, it is still a bit more coastal. And there are some states like Kentucky and West Virginia where broadband penetration is really just a lot lower than it is elsewhere. And it's that 31% of the households that just don't have that broadband connection. They're going to have those streaming problems, buffering, latency, and that's going to present a challenging user experience for really capturing their attention through streaming video. So I'm going to leave you guys with one point, and then if we have a minute or two, we'll take a couple of extra questions. The key message here is change. It's the new norm. So when we did this TV switching research back in April, we found out everything about all of the TV services folks like us have. That's what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. But then we asked, like, how likely are you to sign up for something new in the next year? And, you know, how likely are you to bail or, you know, cancel a subscription or stop using something like a free streaming service that you have today? And there's a couple of really key things that came from this, you know, simple chart right here. If you look at the left, 42% of viewers are saying I have intentions to sign up or try something new. And what's important is that trumps the 29% big time that are looking to cancel or bail on something. What that overall finding suggests to us is we're still in a position where consumers or viewers' time that they're engaging with video overall is likely to continue increasing. The other key message that it shows up is it's going to change. We're entering a period where switching, trying new services, leaving a service is probably going to be at a level higher than anything that we've seen before. So, you know, really understanding what that churn looks like, the demographics of the customer, what other services they're actually looking to jump into and why they're doing that. Well, that's the kind of thing we're hearing a lot from our clients and why we've developed this new research to learn a little bit more about it. Hey guys, thanks so much for the time today. Hopefully in the near future, we can all do this in person. But if there's a couple minutes left, Eric, let's take a few questions and take it from there.
Oh, let's do that. Yeah, thanks a lot. Once again, for questions, we'd love to give you a chance to talk in person. So, if, well, sort of in person. So we'd love to hear from you. If you have a question, do raise your hand. And we don't have a lot of time, but a couple of questions here. Here's one from Stephen Nickerson. Thanks, Steve. Are there consistencies between income demographics and age demographics? That is, the higher income is older, lower income is younger.
Yeah, I mean, there's some basics that we're seeing like that. I think that's most notable when we look at the base of consumers that subscribe to the premium movie channel services like Showtime or HBO Now. In a lot of ways, we're still seeing a more traditional demographic that's a bit older and a bit more affluent. And I think, you know, that's why when we saw AT&T launch HBO Max, we saw a lot of the messaging surround reaching a broader demographic, older and younger, male and female, and doing so with a different mix of programming than HBO has done traditionally. I think we're going to continue to see a lot more of that in the launch strategies with services like Peacock and others as they mature down the road.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, well, let's do one more question. And this is from Doug Montgomery. Basically, what is the definition of broadband? Does that mean 25 megabits per second or something else? How do you define it?
Yeah, for this research, we put it out at 25 megabytes per second. And there's a couple things that are important here. Generally, the people that don't have 25 aren't rocking out a 20 megabyte per second connection. For the most part, they're using DSL lines that are in a 1 to 5 megabyte per second range. And because of that, that 31% of households, a large majority of them, have very slow connections. They are capable of streaming video, but that's why when they have that shared connection throughout a town, they're seeing the buffering problems, the latency problems, and those sort of challenges with using these kind of services.
That's interesting. Yeah, we're out of my little sheltering bunker. We're on DSL because we're on this small little island in Puget Sound, or in South Puget Sound, and we're about 10 megabits per second. But I guess I kind of think of the buffering as a nice way to pass the time. You have a little extra time with the family. You can talk about what's going on. It's just the way we've gotten used to doing things out here. All right, with that, I want to thank John for your presentation. Great data, super interesting. Thank you for being a part of our event today. John's presentation will be available for OTT.X members on our site. There's a couple of questions about that. So yes, we also recorded the session, and that will be on the OTT.X YouTube channel on YouTube shortly. So